Hello and welcome, to a time when the map of the Earth would be unrecognizable to you. When the blue oceans you know so well lapped against the shores of a single, vast land, one so great that it gathered almost all of Earth's continents into a solitary body. It was a time before humanity, before the familiar shapes of the world took form, when the ground beneath your feet might stretch for thousands of miles without meeting another sea. This was Pangea, the world as one. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. No sprawling chain of continents scattered across the globe. No distant lands separated by weeks of sailing. Instead, a single giant expanse of rock and soil and forest, rimmed by endless beaches and the deep roar of the surrounding ocean. If you were to walk in those days, you could begin your journey on the western shore and walk eastward for months, perhaps without ever crossing a saltwater barrier. The Earth was whole in a way it will never be again. The air itself felt different here. Though oxygen still flowed through it, the balance of gases carried the scent of a more ancient planet. The skies stretched vast and unbroken over plains that seemed to go on forever, painted in tones of deep blue and gold. Warm winds drifted across the land from the colossal ocean that wrapped around Pangea like a silver-blue ribbon. Its waves rolled in rhythms as old as the Earth itself, washing against cliffs and sandy shores that had never known the touch of human hands. You might imagine standing at one of those shores, looking out over Pangea. The horizon would seem impossibly far, the curve of the planet barely perceptible. There would be no distant continents to glimpse, no suggestion of another land beyond the line where sky meets sea, just a boundless expanse of water and the steady heartbeat of the waves. Behind you, the land would stretch on, a patchwork of ecosystems, vast deserts, lush river valleys, volcanic highlands, and primeval forests sheltering creatures whose forms you could scarcely recognize. Pangea's formation had been slow, a geologic dance that took hundreds of millions of years. The continents that now sit scattered like puzzle pieces had once wandered freely across the Earth's surface, drifting on massive plates of stone that floated on the molten mantle below. Gradually, over unimaginable spans of time, they drew together, pulled by the deep currents beneath the crust. Mountain ranges rose like wrinkles, where land masses collided, while deep basins filled with salt water as oceans were trapped and reshaped. The final pieces clicked into place around 335 million years ago, and for the next 160 million years, Earth knew an age of unity. It was not a still world, though it might seem so from the great, silent sweep of its horizons. Beneath Pangea's crust, immense forces were always at work. Magma surged and cooled, building mountains, splitting valleys, and feeding volcanoes that sometimes painted the skies with ash and fire. Earthquakes rattled the ground as the plates strained against one another, their slow-motion struggles shaping the land in ways imperceptible to any living creature. The climate, too, carried the signature of this supercontinent's existence. Much of the inland regions were arid, far from the cooling influence of the ocean. Imagine a vast interior desert where the summers burned hot and dry, and the winters could bring biting cold. Along the coasts, where the Pangea breathed moisture into the air, dense forests grew in tangled profusion. River systems twisted through valleys, carrying life-giving water from distant highlands to the sea. Some regions were tropical, drenched in monsoon rains. Others were wind-swept plateaus, where grasses waved like oceans beneath the open sky. And everywhere, life adapted to this great and singular stage. From the shorelines to the forest floors, creatures moved in a world that was at once familiar and alien. Amphibians hunted in rivers, reptiles basked on sun-warmed rocks, and early ancestors of the great dinosaurs prowled the plains. Their calls echoed across the valleys, merging with the distant crash of waves and the whisper of the wind. Insects the size of your hand flitted through the air, their wings catching the sunlight in flashes of green and gold. It was an earth, brimming with vitality, yet untouched by the patterns of human civilization. There was a strange poetry to this unity. The entire planet's land life was connected, not by trade routes or technology, but by the very bones of the earth. Forests could stretch for hundreds of miles without interruption. Species could migrate from one edge of Pangea to the other, if they could endure the journey. Predator and prey were bound together in a single immense web of life that spanned the supercontinent's breadth. If you were to climb one of Pangea's mountain peaks, perhaps in the heart of what would one day be the Appalachian Range or the Urals, you might gaze down over an unbroken panorama of land. The scale would be humbling, valleys so broad that rivers seemed to vanish into the haze, plains fading into desert, and, at last, the shimmering line of the ocean. The air at such heights would be crisp, the wind carrying scents from forests far below. At night, the stars would spill across the sky in uncountable multitudes, their light unblurred by human-made haze, and yet, as eternal as it might seem in your mind's eye, Pangea was never meant to last. The same forces that brought it together were already working to pull it apart. Deep beneath the crust, convection currents in the mantle shifted and swirled, slowly building tension. Cracks would one day split the land. Oceans would invade, carving new coastlines, scattering the fragments of Pangea into the continents we know today. But in this moment, in the span of geologic time that we now imagine it, was whole. Picture the sound of rain falling on one of Pangea's vast river deltas. The drops would tap gently on the broad leaves of ancient ferns, gather in shallow pools, and flow toward the slow, winding river. That water, perhaps, began its journey in a distant highland, hundreds of miles away, and would end in the ocean that wrapped the world. Every drop, every gust of wind, every grain of sand carried in its movement the signature of a unified planet. If you were to walk through one of Pangea's forests, you might feel the soft crunch of ancient leaf litter underfoot, the air damp and cool beneath the canopy. Towering conifers would rise above you, their trunks straight and massive. Lianas and low shrubs would crowd the forest floor, their leaves broad to catch the filtered light. Strange calls of reptiles and amphibians would echo through the shadows. And somewhere nearby, the ripple of a hidden stream would carry the scent of moss and fresh water. The forest would feel endless, and in truth, it very nearly was. It's easy to think of such a world as quiet, but it was alive with sound, only not the kind you are used to. There were no human voices, no engines, no distant hum of cities. Instead, there was the sigh of wind in the grasses, the creak of tree trunks swaying, the rustle of creatures moving unseen. Thunder rolled across the plains when storms gathered, their lightning casting brief, jagged shadows. Waves hissed and roared against rocky shores. In this soundscape, the heartbeat of the earth felt stronger, closer, more tangible. Standing here, in this vision of the past, you might feel small, but you might also feel connected to the deep processes that have shaped our planet for billions of years, to the cycles of creation and destruction that have made and remade the world. Pangea was just one chapter in Earth's story, but it was a chapter written on a scale that is hard to grasp. The unity of this ancient land holds a strange allure. We will never see it again, but in the slow turning of the earth, in the shifting of continents. There is always the possibility that someday, long after Osta landmasses might gather once more. For now, though, it lives only in our imagination, and in the silent testimony of stone. And so, we stand on the shores of Panthalassa in our minds, the wind in our hair, the salt in the air, and the endless land behind us. The world is whole, the horizon unbroken, and the story is just beginning. To the slow, deliberate heartbeat of the planet, we are leaving behind the gentle stillness of simply standing upon Pangea, and now we begin to drift backward further, deeper into the age when it was still becoming, the age when Earth's face was still forming itself into a single, unbroken land. This is the story of the great supercontinent's emergence, not an instant creation, not a sudden snap of nature's fingers, but a patient weaving of stone and ocean, of collision and union. The continents did not rush to meet each other. They wandered for hundreds of millions of years across the restless skin of the planet, driven by forces far beneath their surfaces, forces you could not see, but could feel in every tremor of the ground. Imagine the world before Pangea. The continents, Africa, the Americas, Eurasia, Australia, Antarctica were scattered, drifting upon the surface of Earth's mantle like rafts of ancient rock. Oceans wide as dreams lay between them, and smaller continents long vanished now floated in those waters like forgotten islands. The sky was much the same as the one you know, though it watched over a map that would feel alien beneath your feet. The air smelled of salt and volcanic ash, of warm rain falling upon strange coastlines. This drifting was not aimless. Deep beneath, the crust, slow churning currents of molten rock rose and fell in vast circular motions, pulling the continents along with them. Where these plates met, they sometimes slid past each other with grinding persistence. Other times, they collided head-on, and the crust folded upward into new mountain ranges. In certain places, cracks opened between them, and oceans began to form, spilling across the gap. It was a world in constant, quiet motion. Over tens of millions of years, the continents drew closer, first in twos and threes, then in greater clusters. Africa moved steadily northward. South America began to edge toward it, even then carrying the seeds of the Andes deep within its crust. Ancient North America slid toward Europe, and somewhere, far to the south, land masses now lost to us were pulled into the gathering crowd. The collisions were violent on a scale we can scarcely imagine. When two continental plates met, neither could sink easily into the mantle, for both were made of lighter rock. Instead, their edges crumpled and rose skyward. Volcanoes erupted in chains along their borders, pouring lava into the sky and blackening the daylight for months at a time. Earthquakes rippled outward for hundreds of miles. Rivers were blocked and diverted, seas were closed off, and vast inland basins filled with freshwater lakes. And yet, through these titanic upheavals, life adapted and endured. The oceans teemed with marine creatures, corals, trilobites, ammonites, coiling through the water in slow spirals. Fish swam in brilliant schools, their scales flashing in the filtered light. On land, ferns and conifers rooted themselves into the fresh soil of newly risen mountains. Primitive reptiles prowled along shorelines, and in the shadows, amphibians croaked from shallow pools. You might imagine this earth from a great height, as though seen from the clouds. The continents are on the move, the coastlines shifting from one lifetime to the next. New mountains thrust upward while others are worn away by wind and rain. The ocean's shapes change as the land closes in around them. There is no stillness here, only the slow, unstoppable motion of stone. As the collisions continued, something remarkable began to happen. The separate continents started to knit together into a single vast landmass. The smaller oceans that once lay between them were swallowed, their waters pushed outward into the great surrounding sea. By about 335 million years ago, the union was nearly complete. All but a few scraps of land were drawn into the embrace of this newborn giant. Pangea. The joining of the continents brought profound changes to the planet's climate. Where coastlines once brought moisture inland, vast regions now lay far from any ocean, trapped in the dry heart of the supercontinent. Deserts bloomed across the interior, their sands swept into great dunes by unbroken winds. Rainforests and wetlands clung to the edges, fed by monsoons rolling in from the surrounding Pangea Ocean. The animal world shifted to now that the continents were joined. Creatures could migrate across thousands of miles without crossing a single sea. Species spread into new territories, finding new sources of food, new climates, and new challenges. Predators followed them, learning the shape of the new land as they hunted. Ecosystems became connected in ways that had never before been possible. A single web stretching from the farthest north to the farthest south. If you could walk through this emerging Pangea, you would see landscapes unlike any on Earth today. In some places, jagged mountain ranges still steaming from their birth would rise before you, their peaks hidden in low clouds. At their bases, rivers would rush from melting snowfields, carrying silt into broad, fertile plains. In others, you would cross dry plateaus where the ground cracked under your feet, the sun's heat pressing down like a weight. And at the edges, where the land met the ocean, cliffs of dark stone would plunge into the waves, the spray casting rainbows into the air. The formation of Pangea also reshaped the life in the seas. As smaller oceans closed, many shallow water habitats vanished, and with them, the delicate reefs and communities that had thrived there. Yet the great Pangea, now the dominant ocean of the planet, offered its own abundance. Massive currents swept around the supercontinent, carrying warmth to its poles and stirring nutrients from the deep. In this ocean, life evolved and flourished in patterns that would shape the course of future marine ecosystems. The very face of the planet now carried a new symmetry. One giant landmass surrounded by one giant ocean, a simple, bold design in contrast to the scattered puzzle of continents we know today. From space, had there been eyes to see it, Pangea would have looked like a dark green and brown shield set against the shimmering blue of Pangea. Clouds would spiral lazily above it, casting shadows over deserts, forests, and mountains alike. And yet, for all its grandeur, the making of Pangea was only one chapter in Earth's long, restless story. Before it, other supercontinents had risen, and fallen Rodinia, Nuna Columbial, shattered by the same forces that had brought them together. Pangea was both a continuation of this cycle and a new stage for the unfolding drama of life. You might wonder what it would have been like to stand on the land in the moment when the last of the great collisions occurred, when the final pieces of the puzzle slid into place. The air would be heavy with the scent of volcanic gases. The ground might tremble beneath your feet as distant mountains rose by inches each year. Rivers would change their courses almost overnight, their channels blocked by newly formed ridges. Life would respond in waves, plants sending seeds into unfamiliar soil, animals venturing into unexplored valleys from the perspective of a single lifetime. These changes would seem slow, even imperceptible, but in the long view, the earth had remade itself. The continents had ceased their wandering, locked together into one colossal form. The horizon, in any direction you walked, belonged to the same land in the heart of this unified world, deep within the interior deserts. The night sky would blaze with unfamiliar constellations. No city lights would dim the stars. The Milky Way would spill across the heavens like a river of fire. You might lie back on the warm sand and feel the pulse of the earth through the ground, a reminder that this peace was temporary, that the same forces which had built this land were already, silently, preparing to break it apart. But for now, the great supercontinent had emerged. Its forests, mountains, rivers, and deserts stretched in every direction. Its coasts embraced the endless ocean, and in its unity, it held the promise of life's next great chapter in our journey. We will soon leave the act of creation behind and step into the rhythms of life upon Pangea. How the oceans, winds, and creatures shaped this unified land. But here, in the quiet after the collisions, we stand at the threshold of a world reborn. At the farthest reach of every horizon on Pangea, the land gave way to water. But this was not the familiar blue expanse you might see from a present-day shore. This was the Panthalassian Ocean, so vast it wrapped the entire globe, touching every coast, swallowing half the world in a single, unbroken body. Standing on Pangea's edge, you would have been met with an endless sweep of rolling water, each wave carrying with it the breath of a distant storm, perhaps thousands of miles away. There were no islands dotting the horizon to break the monotony. No other continents rose beyond the curve of sight. Only the slow, deep rhythm of the ocean, eternal and patient, stretching farther than your imagination could follow. The Panthalassa was not just a backdrop, was a force. Its tides pressed against the supercontinent like a heartbeat. Warm, equatorial waters moved steadily toward the poles, cooling as they went, then plunging into the depths to begin the long journey back again. These currents carried life with them, plankton blooms drifting in swirls of green, vast schools of fish following invisible highways beneath the waves, and the occasional shadow of something far larger moving in the deep. The meeting place between Pangea's cliffs and Panthalassa's waters was a place of drama. Storms, born in the heart of the ocean, would march across the surface for weeks before finally unleashing their fury on the coast. Waves could climb as high as small hills, crashing against rocks with the sound of mountains breaking. Sea spray filled the air, leaving a taste of salt on your tongue, and gull-like creatures would ride the wind, calling out in voices carried away by the gale. And yet, in the calm between storms, the coastline was a place of extraordinary beauty. At dawn, the first light of the sun would spill across the surface in liquid gold, and the sound of the tide would blend with the slow creak of the wind in ancient coastal forests. Reptiles would sun themselves on warm rocks, their scales gleaming like polished stone. Small creatures, some no larger than your hand, would scuttle across tide pools, searching for food left behind by the retreating water far from shore. The ocean's surface was deceptively peaceful, masking a living world beneath. In the shallows, coral reefs, different from any you know today's bred, like stone gardens, their strange shapes swaying with the rhythm of the sea. Fish with armor-like plates moved between them, weaving in and out of shadows. Giant cephalopods, their long arms trailing like ribbons, hunted in the deeper channels. And somewhere below, where light could no longer reach, predators moved slowly, waiting for the vibrations of passing prey. The Panthalassa shaped Pangea's climate in subtle but powerful ways. With so much of the Earth's water held in one Continuous ocean storms could gather tremendous strength, and the air above them could carry rain for thousands of miles before finally releasing it over land. Coastal regions thrived under these patterns, their forests lush and green. But the heart of Pangea, far from the reach of these winds, remained dry and harsh, a contrast born from the ocean's reach and its limits. If you were to travel along Pangea's coastline, you would find it anything but uniform. In some places, towering cliffs of basalt and sandstone plunged straight into the waves. In others, the land sloped gently into broad, sandy beaches where shallow lagoons shimmered in the sun. Along certain stretches, volcanic islands hugged the shore, still tethered to the continent, but surrounded on three sides by water, their slopes feeding black sand into the surf. These shores were not empty. They were home to creatures adapted to a life between two world-strong swimmers that could navigate the open sea, but also walkers capable of climbing onto the rocks to bask in the tangled roots of coastal plants. Amphibians laid eggs in hidden pools. Primitive reptiles hunted small fish in the shallows, their quick lunges breaking the glassy surface. And above all of it, the ocean kept its own secrets. Vast trenches cut into the seafloor where tectonic plates met. Along these deep scars, hydrothermal vents poured hot, mineral-rich water into the dark, creating ecosystems that thrived without sunlight. Here, strange life forms isn't like anything on land flourished in the heat. Tubeworms taller than a person, colonies of blind crustaceans, and pale, ghostly fish that hunted by sensing the movement of the water around them. The Panthalassa was more than just a boundary to Pangea. It was a highway. Even in this ancient world, where human eyes had not yet opened to witness it, the ocean carried life from one corner of the earth to another. Creatures rode the currents, spreading to distant coasts. Plant seeds floated in tangled mats of seaweed, drifting for weeks or months before washing ashore and taking root in new lands. In its quiet way, the ocean tied together ecosystems that would otherwise have remained isolated. The sound of the Panthalassa was a constant presence along Pangea's shores. Even in still weather, the ocean murmured a low, endless voice that could be heard from miles inland. In storms, it roared like some ancient living thing, rattling the stones and bending the tallest trees. To live beside it was to feel small, and yet deeply connected to something far older and greater than yourself. And there were moments when the ocean reminded the land of its power. Earthquakes along the coasts sometimes sent great walls of water racing toward the shore. Tsunamis could sweep far inland, leaving behind a new shape to the coastline. These events, though rare, were part of the ocean's cycle, destructive, yet in the long view, part of its endless conversation with the land. You might picture a lone traveler on the cliffs of Pangea's western edge, looking out over the Panthalassa. As the sun sinks low, the wind carries the smell of salt and kelp. Far out at sea, a dark shape breaks the surface, something vast, breathing in the fading light. The traveler watches until it disappears again into the depths, leaving only ripples and the sound of the waves. In that moment, they might understand that the ocean is not just water, it's time itself, flowing without end. In the days of Pangea, the Panthalassa was the keeper of balance, the great counterweight to the supercontinent's mass. It cooled the air, shaped the storms, and nurtured life both above and below. It whispered against every shore, carrying with it the memory of the world before the continents joined, and the inevitability of their partying again. For as eternal as it seemed, even the Panthalassa would one day be transformed. But for now, it was the edge of everything, a mirror to the sky, a cradle for life, and the quiet, ceaseless companion to the land. In the age of Pangea, life was not scattered across far-flung islands or separated by wide oceans. It was bound together on one vast expanse of land, stretching from pole to pole, from humid forests to endless deserts. The animals of this age roamed unbroken distances, their paths shaped not by geography, but by the rhythms of seasons and the search for food. Imagine standing in the middle of that supercontinent. The ground beneath your feet is dry, cracked from months without rain. To the north, the air shimmers with heat, and to the south, faint clouds gather on a distant horizon. There is no sign of a city, no sound of engines, only the slow tread of ancient creatures making their way across the plain. Here, you would see reptiles of every size and form. Not yet the towering dinosaurs that would come millions of years later, but their ancestors, sleek, long-legged predators with sharp teeth and eyes that caught every flicker of movement. They hunted in the open, relying on speed and endurance, chasing smaller animals across the dusty ground. Alongside them, herbivores moved in steady herds, their bodies armored with bony plates or spines. These were survivors of a harsher age, designed to withstand both predators and the changing climate. Some stood as high as your shoulder. Others were no larger than a rabbit, darting quickly from bush to feed. Their tails flicked constantly to scatter flies in the heavy heat. Farther south, the air grew damp and the ground softened under your steps. In these warmer, wetter regions, forests rose, tall conifers with trunks thick enough to take centuries of growth, their branches heavy with needle-like leaves. Beneath their shade, smaller plants thrived, giant ferns, horsetails as tall as a person, and mosses that spread across the forest floor in lush carpets. The air here smelled of resin and wet earth, and every breath carried the faint taste of plant life. In these forests, amphibians still claimed their ancient role as masters of the waterways. Some were small, their slick bodies barely disturbing the surface of the pools where they hunted insects. Others were giant screechers, longer than a man, with powerful jaws and skin patterned like ripples in a pond. They waited in the shallows, still as fallen logs, until a fish or smaller reptile ventured too close. Above the canopy, the skies belonged to early flying reptiles, pterosaurs, gliding on membranous wings. They were not yet the great soaring giants of later ages, but their silhouettes drifted across the sun like leaves in the wind. They would land on riverbanks to feed on fish or take to the air in sudden bursts when startled, their calls echoing through the humid air. Along Pangea's great rivers, life gathered in abundance. These were the arteries of the supercontinent, carrying water and nutrients through its vast heart. Herds of herbivores came to drink, lowering their heads cautiously while predators watched from the shadows. Crocodile-like reptiles basked on the banks, their armor-plated backs soaking up the sun. When they slid into the water, their movements were silent except for the faint ripple they left behind. Insects filled the air, many of them much larger than those you know today. Dragonflies with wingspans as wide as a hawk's drifted above the water, their compound eyes reflecting the green of the forests. Beetles with heavy shells crawled along tree trunks, while clouds of smaller insects moved like drifting smoke in the sunlight. The hum of life was constant, a sound woven into the very air. But not all of Pangea's lands were lush. Much of its interior lay far from the cooling touch of the ocean, and here the days were blistering, the nights cold. In these arid zones, life adapted to scarcity. Reptiles with long, narrow snouts dug into burrows to escape the heat. Hardy plants spread low to the ground, their leaves thick and waxy to preserve water. In the distance, dust devils spun lazily across the plains, marking the movement of dry air over the land. Here, migration was a way of survival. Animals moved with the seasons, following the rains, crossing hundreds of miles between one fertile area and the next. You might have seen their trails worn into the earth, faint lines stretching toward the horizon. Along these paths, predators followed, lean and patient, knowing that sooner or later, hunger would drive the herds into their reach. The coexistence of so many creatures on one connected landmass created an intricate web of interactions. Predators kept the herbivores moving. Grazers shaped the growth of plants. The absence or abundance of rain could change the balance of entire regions. Life here was a constant negotiation with the land, the climate, and each other. In the far north and south, the edges of Pangea touched cooler climates. Here, forests of hardy conifers and cycads gave way to open spaces where frost sometimes gathered on the ground. The animals of these latitudes were built for endurance, thicker skins, slower metabolisms, and behaviors suited to surviving long periods of scarcity. Yet, even here, life thrived, taking what the land offered and waiting out what it withheld. Everywhere you looked, there were traces of movement, footprints pressed into mud, claw marks on tree trunks, bones left from an unfinished meal. Over time, these signs would vanish, washed away by rain or buried beneath dust. But for those who lived here, they were messages written in the language of survival. There were moments, too, of stillness. At dusk, when the heat of the day faded, the plains grew quiet except for the distant calls of night hunters. In the forests, the wind shifted, carrying cooler air through the branches. Along the rivers, the surface became a mirror for the stars, and small creatures emerged from hiding to feed in the safety of darkness. It was a world both untamed and deeply ordered. Each creature, from the smallest insect to the largest reptile, had its place. The patterns of life repeated year after year, bound by the turning of the earth, the tilt of its axis, and the slow breathing of the seasons. And yet, beneath this sense of permanence, change was already at work. New species were evolving to meet the challenges of their environments. Old ones were fading, unable to keep pace. The land itself was shifting, though too slowly for the eyes of those who walked upon it to see. Looking back from the present, it's tempting to see Pangea as a single moment, a snapshot frozen in time. But in truth, it was alive in every sense, a place of constant movement and transformation. Life roamed freely here, unbound by the barriers that would later divide the continents. It was an earth both familiar and strange, a living bridge between what came before and the worlds yet to come. In the heart of that vast supercontinent, under the endless sky, life moved with a rhythm older than memory. The footsteps of those ancient creatures are gone now, but their story remains written in stone, whispered in fossils, and remembered in the very shape of the continents that were once one. Above the endless stretches of Pangea's land, the sky was a living canvas, vast, unbroken, and unlike anything we know today. Without the scattered continents of our modern Earth, wind and weather flowed with a different rhythm, sweeping unhindered across thousands of miles. This was a sky where clouds could be born over warm inland seas and drift for weeks before meeting the mountains that would finally break them apart. If you could stand there and look upward, you might first notice how deep and pure the blue appeared. On clear days, the air shimmered with heat, making the horizon dance like liquid. The sun climbed high, burning down with little mercy, and shadows lay sharp and dark beneath trees and rocks. But as the hours passed, the sky would begin to tell its stories. In some regions, towering thunderheads rose each afternoon, their white walls stretching higher than mountains, turning gray as their bellies filled with rain. You would see lightning flash inside them like the flicker of a giant lantern. In others, the sky remained cloudless for months, the sun ruling without interruption, its path steady and unchanging through the dry air. The winds themselves were creatures of habit and power. With no oceans to break their path, they could sweep across Pangea in long, uninterrupted streams, gathering heat from the vast deserts in the interior before rushing toward the coasts with fierce intensity. These winds carried dust-fine particles from the heart of the supercontinent that could drift for hundreds of miles, turning sunsets into blazing spectacles of red and gold. And at night, when the sun fell behind the distant horizon, a different sky took its place. With little moisture or pollution to dim the view, the stars burned bright and close, scattered across the heavens in dazzling clusters. You could see the Milky Way as a luminous river stretching from one end of the horizon to the other. Some nights, the air was so clear you might have believed you could walk into that starlit path and never return. The moon, too, was familiar yet strange. Its phases passed just as they do today, but without modern light to drown it out. Its glow painted the land in silver. Forests shimmered softly, rivers turned to ribbons of light, and the deserts gleamed pale under its gaze. Creatures of the night emerged under this glow, small reptiles, insects, and early mammalian ancestors, all moving quietly through the cool darkness. The climate of Pangea shaped the skies in ways both subtle and dramatic. The interior of the continent, far from the tempering influence of the sea, baked under extreme heat during the day and cooled sharply at night. Warm air rose in shimmering waves, forming dust storms that could blot out the sun for hours. These storms rolled like living walls across the land, reshaping dunes and burying everything in their path beneath fine layers of sand. Closer to the coasts, moisture brought softer skies. The sun burned them away. Over warm, shallow seas, clouds gathered in sweeping arcs, their undersides tinged with shades of pink and gold. Rain fell in sudden bursts, drumming against the leaves of ancient forests and filling the rivers that would wind deep into the heart of the continent. And there were storms unlike anything we know today. With the sheer size of Pangea and the unique patterns of its atmosphere, some weather systems grew massive, spanning entire regions, lasting for weeks and shifting the balance of life wherever they passed. Imagine a single storm beginning over the warm waters of an inland sea, building as it traveled for thousands of miles until it reached the cooler air of the highlands. There, it would release its strength in torrents, swelling rivers beyond their banks and carving new channels into the earth. The skies also carried life. Currents, they soared with barely a movement, covering great distances in search of fish or small prey. Some had crests that caught the sun like bright flags, signaling to mates below. Others glided silently, their dark shapes passing over forests and plains without sound. Birds, as we know them, had not yet appeared, but the air was far from empty. Insects drifted in swarms so vast they could be seen from the ground like dark clouds. Dragonflies, larger than a human hand, darted among them, their wings beating in blurs of silver. Occasionally, a predator from the skies would dive swift, leathery shadows snatching a meal before vanishing back into the sunlit heights. Sunrises in Pangea were were slow and gentle in some places, fierce and sudden in others. Over the deserts, the horizon would first glow faintly, then blaze into gold as the sun cleared the land in a matter of moments. Over the forests, morning arrived like a whisper, light filtering through layers of mist and leaves, turning dew into tiny jewels. The smell of warming resin and damp earth would rise with the first heat of the day, mingling with the calls of waking creatures. Sunsets, however, were often spectacular. With so much dust in the atmosphere, the light scattered into deep reds, fiery oranges, and rich purples. The whole horizon could seem aflame, the colors reflecting off rivers, seas, and the very skin of the animals moving across the land. On certain evenings, when the winds were calm and the air still, the fading light would linger long after the sun was gone, leaving the land bathed in a soft, otherworldly glow. The auroras of this age would have been a rare and mesmerizing sight. Without city lights to obscure them, the shifting ribbons of green and violet could be seen far from the poles during times of high solar activity. They would ripple across the night like slow waves, casting faint colors over forests and plains. Animals might pause in their movements, sensing something in the silent dance above them. Weather patterns on Pangea were also deeply tied to the slow heartbeat of geological time. The supercontinent's shape and size influenced ocean currents and air circulation, creating long cycles of wet and dry periods. Over thousands of years, regions that were once lush and green could become arid and barren, while deserts could slowly give way to forests. The skies would change, with these shifts, clouds forming in places that had been clear for centuries. Rains falling where dust once ruled. In the highlands and mountain ranges, the air was thinner, the winds sharper. From those heights, you could see the great expanse of Pangea laid out beneath you, stretching farther than the eye could follow. The sky here seemed even larger, the stars even closer. Storms could be watched from a distance as they rolled across the plains like dark, slow-moving giants. And always, the skies carried a sense of eternity. The same moon that watched over its deserts rises each night in our own. Even the patterns of the stars, though shifted by the slow drift of continents, would be familiar to anyone looking up from that ancient world. Yet there was something undeniably different about the air of Pangea's skies, a quality born from the unity of its land and the openness of its horizons. Without the barriers we know today, the atmosphere moved like a single, breathing entity. Its moods felt across the breadth of the supercontinent. When it rained in one corner of Pangea, the winds carried the scent of that rain hundreds of miles away. When dust rose from the heart of the deserts, it painted sunsets on distant shores. To live under such skies was to be part of a vast and interconnected whole. Every cloud, every glist of wind, every glimmer of starlight was shared by all who roamed its land. And though millions of years have passed since those days, the memory of that sky lingers in the rocks that record ancient climates, in the fossils of creatures who looked upward just as we do, and perhaps even in the quiet sense of wonder that still rises in us when we watch the horizon fade into night. Beneath Pangea's skies, life unfolded in a rhythm as old as the earth itself. Each day and night another verse in the endless song of the world. And as we imagine that sky now, we can almost feel the winds of that lost age brushing against our skin, carrying with them the whispers of a time when the world was one. Across the vast and ancient expanse of Pangea, rivers moved like silver threads through a tapestry of green and gold. They wound their way through deep valleys and open plains, carrying the lifeblood of the land from the high mountains to the faraway seas. Some began as narrow trickles born in the snowmelt of distant peaks. Others burst forth from underground springs, their waters cool and clear, flowing in winding arcs through the heart of the supercontinent. Imagine standing at the bank of one of these mighty rivers. The air here is damp and fragrant, heavy with the scent of wet earth, moss, and blooming ferns. The surface of the water glitters in the sun, broken only by ripples from fish or the dipping wings of an insect. These rivers were unlike those we know today, not just in size, but in their very purpose. With Pangea's unique geography, some rivers traveled thousands of miles without meeting the sea, instead draining into vast inland basins or vanishing into wetlands so immense that they seemed to have no end. Many of these waterways carved deep paths into the land, creating gorges where sunlight barely touched the bottom. Ferns and horsetails grew thick along the walls, their leaves forming a living curtain over the water. Early conifers stretched tall above, their trunks rising like pillars, their shadows dappling the surface below. If you followed the sound of rushing water upstream, you might find waterfalls hidden within these green cathedrals, their constant roar echoing off stone shaped over millions of years. The forests of Pangea were equally vast and varied, each one shaped by the climate of its region. Near the coasts, warm and humid air fed lush, dense jungles where every branch seemed alive. Giant insects droned in the air, their wings catching the light. Reptiles basked on fallen logs, their scales patterned in earthy tones that mirrored the forest floor. In the distance, the calls of strange creatures echoed deep, resonant sounds from animals whose shapes would be unfamiliar to modern eyes. Farther inland, the forests became drier, filled with hardy conifers and cycads that could withstand long seasons without rain. Their needles and fronds reached upward, swaying gently in the hot breeze. Beneath them, small plants clung to the shade, their roots finding pockets of moisture hidden deep within the soil. Here, the rivers were narrow and quick, darting between rocks and fallen trunks, their waters carrying silt that painted the banks in shades of ochre and red. Some forests were so ancient that their trees had been standing for centuries. Their bark bore the scars of storms and the marks of climbing animals. Beneath their canopies, the air was still and cool, filled with a constant hush, broken only by the rustle of leaves or the sudden crack of a branch in the damp earth. The roots of these trees wove together like the threads of a great net, holding the soil against the pull of erosion and the wash of seasonal floods. And life followed the water. Herds of early reptiles and synapsids came to drink from the riverbanks, leaving tracks that would one day be fossilized in stone. Insects hatched in the shallow pools, their delicate forms rising into the air before drifting toward the forest in search of food. Predators, both in the water and on land, waited in patience. Fish with sharp teeth gliding beneath the surface, crocodile-like creatures lurking in the shallows, and swift, agile hunters moving through the shadows. The rhythm of the rivers dictated the rhythm of the forests. During wet seasons, the waters would swell, spilling into floodplains and soaking the soil. Seeds hidden in the ground would awaken, sprouting into carpets of green that spread across the land. Flowers opened in bursts of color, attracting pollinators that moved from bloom to bloom. In the drier months, the rivers would shrink, leaving behind pools where fish and amphibians gathered in shrinking numbers, easy prey for the patient and the swift. Over the centuries, these waterways carved not just the land, but the lives of everything upon it. Animals migrated along their courses, using the rivers as guides through the vastness of Pangea. Forests spread outward from their banks, their roots reaching ever closer to the water's edge. And in return, the rivers carried away fallen leaves, broken branches, and nutrients, feeding wetlands and inland seas far beyond the forest's edge, in the heart of the supercontinent, where the land stretched farther from the sea than anywhere on Earth today. Rivers became lifelines. Without them, the interior would have been an unforgiving desert, dry and scorching beneath an unbroken sun. Instead, the waters gathered from distant storms and snowmelt, flowing slowly across the plains, bringing life to places that would otherwise have known none. Along their banks, narrow corridors of green cut through the arid landscapes, havens for creatures moving between the wetter lands. Some of these rivers carried secrets beneath their surfaces. Their depths hid stones smoothed by centuries of current, and in some places, buried trees turned to stone over the course of millions of years. The fossils of fish, amphibians, and even plants lay within their sediment, waiting for a time far in the future when the earth would shift and human hands would uncover them. The forests themselves were living museums of evolution. From the ground to the highest canopy, every layer teemed with life. Mosses and fungi spread in the dim undergrowth, breaking down fallen wood into the soil that fed the roots above. Ferns unfurled delicate fronds, catching droplets of mist and light. Above them, small reptiles hunted insects on the trunks, their movements quick and sure. In the branches, pterosaurs rested between flights, watching the ground with keen eyes. Seasons in Pangea's forests were marked not just by temperature, but by the flow of water. In times of abundance, rivers swelled and forest floors turned soft with mud, the air rich with the sound of flowing streams and the chorus of countless creatures. In times of drought, leaves turned brittle, streams shrank to cracked beds, and animals moved in search of the next source of water. This constant change shaped the resilience of life, teaching it to adapt, to move, and to endure. If you were to drift along one of these rivers, you would pass through a dozen worlds in a single journey, from high mountain forests where cool mists hung in the air, to sunlit lowlands where broad-leafed plants swayed in the breeze, to wetlands where the water spread into shimmering mirrors of sky. Each stretch of the river would offer something new, and at night, as the air cooled and the forests grew quiet, you might hear the soft movements of nocturnal creatures coming to the banks to drink under the moonlight. Pangea's rivers and forests were more than just landscapes. They were the arteries and lungs of a living planet, carrying water, life, and air in a cycle that had been turning since long before humans ever walked the earth. And though that supercontinent has long since broken apart, the rivers we know today still carry echoes of those ancient flows, and the forests still remember, in their roots and their rhythms, the age when the world was one. The air above Pangea was a restless thing. It moved with purpose, sweeping across plains that seemed to stretch forever, gathering heat under an unbroken sun. The size of the supercontinent meant that winds could travel for weeks without meeting the cooling touch of an ocean. By the time they reached the coastlines, they had transformed into giant storms of a scale and strength beyond anything we know today. Imagine standing at the heart of this land, far from the sea, where the horizon trembled in the heat. The sky would begin to shift, colors deepening from the pale blues of morning to the heavy grays of a brewing tempest. A stillness would fall, so complete that even the rustle of leaves seemed to hold its breath. Then, somewhere far away, a low and rolling growl thunder that belonged not to a single cloud, but to an entire sky in motion. Storms in the age of Pangea were shaped by extremes. Summers in the continental interior could grow scorching, with temperatures soaring under the sun's relentless gaze. Heat rose in shimmering waves from the baked earth, drawing moisture from every living thing. Along the coasts, where ocean currents met the edge of the land, cooler, wetter air waited. When these forces collided, the result was often spectacular, a clash of heat and moisture that would give birth to storms that towered into the upper atmosphere, their anvils spreading for hundreds of miles. Some of these were gentle rains, sweeping over forests in soft, steady sheets, feeding the rivers and coaxing life from the soil. But others arrived with fury. Walls of black cloud rolled across the land, their edges lit by the flicker of lightning. The winds arrived first, bending trees and scattering leaves, sending dust spiraling into the air. Then the rain came, heavy and unbroken, drumming on the canopy, pounding into the earth until rivers swelled and floodplains vanished beneath a restless, churning current. Hailstones, some as large as a fist, could fall from these storms, their icy weight shattering leaves and branches before melting into the muddy water below. Lightning, drawn to the tallest conifers or exposed cliffs, would strike again and again, leaving scars in the bark and splitting stone with its sudden heat. In the open plains, grasslands could catch fire in the wake of such storms, sending columns of smoke into the darkened sky. Yet, for all their violence, these storms also shaped the rhythm of life. The forests drank deeply from their rains. Seeds carried by the wind found new soil in the wake of floods. Animals learned the signs of approaching winter, the shifting wind, the sharp scent of ozone, the flicker of distant light and moved. Accordingly, some seeking shelter in deep burrows, others standing their ground in the downpour. Farther south, near the equator, storms took on a different face. Here, the warm oceans that bordered Pangea brewed immense cyclones. Without the barriers of modern continental arrangements, these storms could spin across thousands of miles of open water before striking land with unimaginable force. When they did, they brought winds that tore through coastal forests, uprooting trees that had stood for centuries. The sea itself rose under their push, sending great walls of water inland, reshaping shorelines and carving new channels through the land. Along the deserts that stretched in Pangea's drier regions, storms were rare but dramatic. Months of dry heat would be broken by sudden, short-lived bursts of rain, so intense that the ground could not drink them in. Flash floods would tear through canyons, carrying boulders and whole trees in their path. When the water receded, it left behind a transformed landscape, new channels, fresh layers of sediment, and pockets of water where life could gather until the next dry season claimed them. In the higher latitudes, where the air cooled with the tilt of the seasons, storms often carried snow. Entire forests could vanish beneath a deep, heavy silence, their branches bowed under the weight of ice. When the snow melted, it fed the rivers in great surges, sending water rushing toward the lowlands. These seasonal changes sculpted the land over countless centuries, carving valleys and building fertile plains from the silt carried downstream. The size of Pangea meant that its weather patterns were not quick to change. Storm systems could linger for weeks, drifting slowly across the continent. For creatures that lived here, this meant long periods of sheltering or long journeys to follow the rain as it moved. Migratory paths often mirrored the wandering trails of storms. As animals learned where fresh water and new growth would appear in their wake. Even the earth beneath the storms was changing. Tremors shook the land, opening new springs and redirecting rivers. Volcanic eruptions, fed by the restless movements of tectonic plates, could send ash into the sky, altering weather patterns for years at a time. The combination of volcanic gases and the heat of the sun could drive greenhouse conditions, amplifying the energy that fed the storms. At night, storms over Pangea carried a beauty that was almost otherworldly. Without the lights of cities, the darkness was pure and deep, and the flashes of lightning could illuminate the land for miles. You might see the silhouette of a distant ridge lit in stark white, or the shape of a forest canopy rippling in the wind before fading back into shadow. The sound of rain on leaves, the distant rumble of thunder rolling endlessly across the plains, these were the sounds that filled the nights of Pangea. Just as the day was filled with their light and motion, life learned not just to endure the storms, but to use them. Some plants released their seeds only when soaked by heavy rains, ensuring they would sprout in the most favorable conditions. Certain animals timed their breeding to coincide with the wet season, when food and shelter were most abundant. Even the rivers swelled in rhythm with the storms, carrying nutrients into new territories and connecting distant ecosystems over millions of years. Storms shaped the very map of the continent. Rivers changed their courses under the pressure of floods. Coastlines retreated and advanced under the push of storm-driven seas. Valleys deepened, ridges eroded, and plains grew richer under the deposits left by the floodwaters. Without these storms, the face of Pangea, the life that thrived upon it, would have been entirely different. And though the supercontinent is gone, the storms of today carry faint echoes of those ancient tempests. The rivers that flow now were once fed by rains that fell on a united land. The patterns of wind and ocean, though changed, still remember the old pathways carved when the continents were one. Somewhere in the deep memory of Earth's atmosphere, the storms of Pangea still turn, their thunder rolling endlessly over a world that no longer exists. Beneath the vast plains and mountains of Pangea, the earth was never still. It breathed in the slow language of stone and magma, its movements measured in millennia rather than moments. To stand on the surface then was to stand atop a restless, giant one whose whispers were not carried in words, but in the deep rumble of the ground, the slow heave of ridges, and the hiss of steam rising from hidden vents. The land itself told stories if you knew how to listen. Along the edges of the supercontinent, where the ocean lapped against rocky shores, the crust was thin and restless. Here, magma sometimes pushed through in fountains of molten light, pouring into the sea with a sound like an eternal sigh. Steam rose in thick clouds, drifting inland and feeding rain far from their birthplace. These volcanic breaths were not rare in the age of Pangea. They were part of the rhythm of the earth, marking the points where the planet's inner fire touched the surface. Inland, the whispers took another form. Tectonic plates, locked together in uneasy alliance, strained under the pressures of their own weight. The interior of Pangea was crisscrossed with deep fault lines, some ancient and quiet, others newly restless. Occasionally, the land would shudder. In the great forest's leaves would tremble without wind. On the plains, herds would pause, their ears pricked to a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Sometimes, the tremor was only a murmur, fading in moments. Other times, it rolled on, breaking cliffs into rubble, and sending rock slides thundering into valleys. In the deserts, the earth spoke in a different way. The wind carved sandstone into strange and towering shapes, and the ground beneath would sometimes split without warning. These cracks revealed layers of the planet's history bands of red, gold, and gray stone that told of ancient seas vanished, rivers and climates long gone. To walk among these silent sculptures was to walk through time itself. The shifting of the earth shaped more than just the land. It shaped life. Rivers were born when fault lines opened and diverted underground water to the surface. New valleys created havens where forests could grow, sheltered from the harsher climates beyond. Mountains rose like walls, redirecting the winds and creating new patterns of rain and drought. Entire ecosystems appeared or vanished, all in the slow wake of the planet's movements. Along certain ridges, vents of warm air and gas seeped from the ground. Some were harmless, carrying only the scent of minerals and the warmth of the deep earth. Others were dangerous, their fumes invisible but deadly to those who lingered too long. Even in these harsh places, life adapted. Small, strange plants took root in the mineral-rich soil. Insects and reptiles found warmth there during the cold seasons, making their homes in the rocks that were always just slightly warmer than the surrounding air dot. In places where volcanic activity was strongest, the Earth's whispers became roars. Lava flowed down slopes in glowing rivers, lighting the night in shades of orange and red. Ash fell like snow, blanketing forests and grasslands in silence. The heat could destroy entire regions in days, but over time, it also gave life back, enriched the soil, making it more fertile than before. In the seasons after an eruption, these areas often bloomed brighter and greener than they had in decades. Imagine walking across one of Pangea's great fault zones. Beneath your feet, the rock is fractured, worn smooth by countless years of shifting. You might hear nothing, but you might feel a faint vibration, a heartbeat deep in the ground. It is the sound of plates pushing, the slow and unstoppable motion that would one day tear Pangea apart. You would not see the change in your lifetime, but the earth was already moving toward it, 1 inch at a time. The animals of Pangea understood the language of the shifting earth in ways we can only guess. Fossilized trackways show sudden changes in direction, as though entire herds had turned and fled from something unseen. Perhaps it was the faint trembling of an approaching quake. Perhaps it was the sound of rocks splitting far away, a sound low and deep enough to be felt more than heard. Birds and small reptiles likely fled to higher ground before floods caused by shifting riverbeds, following instincts passed down over millions of years, that there were places where the ground itself seemed alive. Mud volcanoes bubbled quietly in low valleys, their surfaces pocked with round, wet craters that belched gas into the air. Mineral springs painted the rocks around them in colors of rust, turquoise, and ivory. In geothermal fields, the soil was soft and warm underfoot, steaming gently in the morning light. These were places of both beauty and danger-rich in life, but unpredictable in temperament. The whispers from beneath also carried a promise. Every movement, every quake, every eruption was part of a much larger story, the slow breaking and remaking of the earth. The forces that created Pangea were the same forces that would undo it. Even as the landmass stood in its greatest unity, the seeds of its future separation were being sown deep below. Magma pushed outward, searching for escape. Plates shifted against each other, opening faults that would one day become oceans, and always, the earth spoke softly in the language of change. You might stand on a mountainside and hear the gentle crumble of rock loosening under the pull of gravity. You might sit by a river and notice how its course had shifted since the last heavy rains, cutting a little deeper into its banks. Each of these small moments was part of a greater movement, one that had begun long before life first stepped onto land, and one that would continue long after Pangea was gone. At night, when the air cooled and the world seemed to sleep, the earth still murmured. Rocks contracted with the cold, making faint cracking sounds in the dark. Far away, a cliff might give way with a sound like distant thunder. Beneath it all, too deep for us to hear, the slow churn of magma carried on, as constant as the tides. The shifting earth of Pangea was not something to be feared. It was the breath and heartbeat of the planet itself. Every hill, every valley, every coastline was a word in its endless story. And as the continents of today drift slowly apart, they still move to that same quiet rhythm, carrying with them the memory of the time when all the land was one, and the earth's whispers shaped a world unlike any we know. It began so quietly that, had you stood there then, you would not have noticed. The ground beneath Pangea, which had long seemed so solid and eternal, was already pulling itself apart, deep below the surface, in the slow, hot churn of the mantle. Great streams of molten rock shifted their paths. Heat built in pockets where it had not before, pushing upward, softening the crust in subtle, hidden ways. For millions of years, the supercontinent had held together its weight and vastness, seeming like permanence itself. But permanence is an illusion in the language of the earth. The first signs were fractures, long, shallow cracks that stretched for miles across the land. They appeared quietly, sometimes hidden beneath forests or sand, sometimes tracing visible scars across the bare stone. The easiest path downhill began to flow into them. Over centuries, these rivers deepened the fractures into valleys, slicing Pangea with slow, patient strokes. Along the coasts, the sea crept into low-lying rifts, filling them with salt water. These new inlets, cut deeper each year, pulled inland by tides and storms. In the heart of the supercontinent, far from any ocean, lakes formed in the widening rift valleys, fed by mountain streams and seasonal rains. These lakes, calm on their surface, hid deep chasms below, fissures where the land was being quietly hollowed out by the forces beneath. Imagine standing on one of those early rift edges. At first, the change might seem almost unnoticeable, just a cliffside where rock had split cleanly away from the land beside it. But then, over centuries, you would see the cliff grow taller, the gap below it grow wider. Where once you could cross in a day's walk, it would now take weeks to find a safe passage. Trees that had once grown in a continuous forest now leaned toward the void, their roots clawing at the edges as the soil beneath them slowly gave way. The breaking was not uniform. Some regions remained locked together, their crust too thick, their tectonic bonds too strong. Others yielded quickly, their rock soft with heat from below. Lava spilled into the rift valleys, cooling into new land even as the surrounding plates drifted apart. The air smelled of sulfur and ash. The ocean in narrow channels became wide straits, and wide straits became seas. Water, their climates transformed. Warm sea breezes carried moisture far into the land, creating lush new habitats where deserts had once spread. Elsewhere, places that had been wet and fertile grew dry as mountains rose and blocked the flow of rain clouds. This transformation reshaped the lives of the creatures who roamed Pangea. Herds that had once traveled unbroken distances across the continent now faced barriers of water or impassable cliffs. Species became isolated from one another, their paths cut off by the widening seas. In the oceans, new currents formed, carrying nutrients and warmth to places that had once been cold and empty. This shift stirred life into patterns never seen before, creating the early seeds of ecosystems that would one day flourish in entirely separate continents. From above, if one could have looked down with eyes as sharp as a hawk's. At first thin and faint, they grew darker and wider as the centuries passed. Here and there, pieces of the once whole land began to drift ever so slightly apart, each carrying the memory of its place in the greater whole, the Earth's voice. In this breaking was not one of violence but of patience. Even the most dramatic events, the sudden eruption of a volcano, the collapse of a cliff into the sea, were only moments in a much larger unfolding. The true power of this transformation lay in its slowness. It was change that no single lifetime could witness in full. Deep earthquakes rumbled through the rift valleys, shaking loose rock and soil in landslides that roared down into the chasms. These quakes were the earth adjusting itself, releasing the strain that had built up over millennia. Afterward, the land would settle again into its slow drift, as though nothing had happened. But the scars remained, and over time they deepened into the map lines of a future world. The supercontinent's breaking also altered the skies. Winds shifted to follow the new coastlines, bringing storms to places that had once been calm and drying out regions that had once been green. Lightning danced over the new seas, reflecting in their dark waters. Monsoons gathered strength from the warmth of freshly formed oceans, sweeping across the land with a power that reshaped forests and plains. At night, the breaking land had a different voice. In the rift zones, the ground would sigh with the faint hiss of escaping gases. The air was warmer near these vents, carrying a metallic scent that lingered on the wind. Far away, the low growl of distant eruptions would sometimes carry for miles, a reminder that the earth beneath was alive and in motion, and still life adapted. Plants took root in the fertile ash left by volcanoes. Fish and other marine creatures found new homes in the sheltered bays and channels carved by the encroaching sea. Birds began to follow the lines of the rift valleys, using them as pathways for migration. The breaking of Pangea was not an ending, it was a transformation. Before you, a deep chasm stretched to the horizon, its far side just a shadow in the evening light. Far below, the faint glimmer of water reflected the last glow of the sky. The air carried the mingled scents of salt and sulfur, earth and rain. Behind you, the land rolled on in forests and plains. But ahead lay a future in which these two worlds would never touch again. Over millions of years, the drifting plates carried pieces of the old supercontinent away from one another, slowly at first, then with greater speed as the mantle's currents urged them on. The Americas, Eurasia, Australia, and Antarctica. Each would carry with it the geology, the fossils. Was not just the creation of our modern continents, it was the beginning of the world as we know it. The climates, the migration of species, the very currents of the oceans were all born from this long, slow partying mantle. Somewhere deep below your feet, even now, the same forces are at work. The same heat is building in hidden places. The same tension is pressing at the edges of plates. One day, long after us, the continents will meet again, and a new supercontinent will rise. The cycle will continue, and the earth will keep its slow, patient conversation with itself, because the breaking of Pangea was never truly an end, was a turning of the page. The world we know now is scattered, its continents separated by vast oceans, its climates shaped by distant mountain ranges and wandering currents. Yet if you look closely, the fingerprints of Pangea are still everywhere, in the curve of a coastline, in the deep memory of a species, in the very way the wind moves across the globe. The western edge of Africa fits neatly into the eastern curve of South America, as if they were puzzle pieces that once belonged together. The jagged outline of North America's eastern coast aligns with parts of Europe and Northwest Africa. These shapes are not coincidence, they are remnants of a time when these lands lay side by side. In the mountains of Appalachia in North America, you can find stones and fossil beds that match perfectly with those in the Scottish Highlands and Norway. These rocks were born of the same ancient ranges, formed when continents collided during Pangea's assembly. Though the Atlantic Ocean now lies between them, they are siblings in stone. Antarctica. South America can find the remains of the same extinct plants, broad-leaved ferns like Glossopteris, which once blanketed Pangea's temperate regions. You can imagine their green fronds waving in the wind of a single vast plain, their spores drifting across what is now an ocean. These plants knew nothing of borders. Their range was as wide as the supercontinent itself. Animals, too, carry the echoes. Fossils of the freshwater reptile Mesosaurus, a small, crocodile-like creature. Conclusion is simple and beautiful. There was once no ocean at all, only a winding river or inland lake that crossed a united land. The Earth remembers Pangea in its weather, too. Our modern climate patterns, with their monsoons, trade winds, and ocean currents. Some of these currents were set in motion during the breaking of Pangea, and though the land has continued to drift, their influence lingers. The warm waters of the Gulf Stream, the upwelling currents along the west coasts of Africa and South America, they are descendants of a planetary circulation first rearranged. When the supercontinent split, even the living creatures around us, today humans included, are part of Pangea's legacy. The distribution of early mammal ancestors, dinosaurs, and other prehistoric life was determined by the paths that Pangea's land offered. The great migrations of these creatures carved genetic patterns that still echo in modern species, ancient connections that there are subtler reminders, two things you might not expect. The soil composition in certain parts of North America matches that of distant Africa because they were formed from the same parent rock before the split. The magnetic minerals in those rocks point in directions that no longer make sense. You remember that the land itself has moved, carrying these tiny compasses away from their original alignment. Sometimes the echoes are hidden in stories. Indigenous myths from far-apart cultures tell of lands that once stretched endlessly in every direction, or of great floods that rose to separate people and animals. These are not scientific records, but they are cultural memories passed down through generations that may preserve a distant awareness of land once joined and then lost. You might walk along a beach today, the waves lapping gently at your feet, and not realize you are standing on the edge of a wound that opened hundreds of millions of years ago. The Atlantic Ocean is a scar in the fabric of the earth, beautiful, teeming with life, but also a reminder of the rift that began the breaking of Pangea. In the past, it also shapes our future. The continents are still moving, still drifting on the slow currents of the mantle. The Atlantic is widening by a few centimeters each year. The Pacific, meanwhile, is shrinking. If you could watch the Earth over the next few 100 million years, you would see a slow, elegant dance continents colliding and partying again. Eventually, they will come together to form a new supercontinent. Geologists have given names to these future possibilities: Messia, Novopangea, Pangea, Ultima, but whatever its shape, the cycle will continue. The echoes of the old will guide. The birth of the new mountains will rise again where oceans now flow. And perhaps, in that distant time, someone will stand on a shore and look out across the horizon, wondering what the world once looked like when it was whole. There is a strange comfort in knowing that nothing in the Earth's arrangement is final. Pangea was not the first supercontinent, and it will not be the last. Before it came Rodinia, before that Nuna, and before that still older lands with names lost to time. Each one left its imprint on the rocks, on the oceans, on life itself. And yet, though they vanish, they never vanish entirely. Every mountain, every coastline, every fossil bone is a note in the long song of the planet. The melody carries forward, weaving ancient chords into the present. If you pause and listen not just with your ears, but with your mind, you might feel those echoes in the currents of the air that touch your skin. They are in the stars too, in a way, because the same sky that looked down on Pangea still looks down on us. The constellations have shifted in their slow drift, just as the continents have, but the light from those distant suns still travels here, still falls across the earth in patterns older than the land itself. And so, Pangea is not gone. It is present in every map, in every shoreline, in every story the earth tells, that crossed its vast plains and swam in its lakes. In a way, we are all children of Pangea, our histories, written on a stage it once held together. The ground we call home was shaped by its rise and its breaking, and the forces that moved it are still moving, quietly, patiently. Perhaps, one night, far in the future, when a new supercontinent has risen, there will be voices speaking softly of a land called Pangea, wondering how it felt to live in the time when the world was one.